welcome to the second in this year's series of online research seminars hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. You'll be aware that this event is being recorded, and we'll be adding the recording to our YouTube channel shortly, where you'll also find recordings of all our previous seminars, together with other online BCLT events. So as always, I'm very grateful to my BCLT colleagues Anna Good and Sally Dix for their technical assistance. Over the summer, I attended the Triennial Congress of the European Society for Translation Studies at the University of Leeds here in the UK. And one of the short papers that made the strongest impression on me there was given by Brian James Baer. So I was delighted when Brian accepted my invitation to give a fuller version of that paper in the BCLT Research Seminar Series today. Brian James Baer is Professor of Russian and Translation Studies at Kent State University in Ohio, USA. He's the founding editor of the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies and co-editor of the Bloomsbury book series, Literature's Cultures Translation with Michelle Woods, and of the Routledge book series, Translation Studies in Translation with Yifan Zhu. He publishes widely on translation history, translation pedagogy, and translation theory. His most recent publications include the monographs Translation and the Making of Modern Russian Literature, which came out from Bloomsbury in 2015, and Queer Theory and Translation Studies, Language, Politics, Desire, which came out with Routledge in 2020. And the translations Culture, Memory and History, Essays in Cultural Semiotics by Yuri Lotman, which appeared from Palgrave Macmillan in 2019, and Introduction to Translation Theory by Andrei Fyodorov from Routledge in 2021, the last of which won the EST Translation Prize. In 2023-24, Brian was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He's the current president of the American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association and sits on the International Advisory Board of the Mona Baker Center for Translation Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. I'll hand over to Brian shortly, but before that, just let me say that after his talk, we'll have time for a question and answer session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you particularly would like to see answered. So that function is available to you all the way through. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I'll put them to Brian on your behalf at the end. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Brian James Baer for a talk which is titled Translation and the Cold War, Tracing the Emergence of the Star Translator. Welcome, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. Very happy to be here. I'll share my PowerPoint. Yes, excellent. Thank you so much for having me today. So what I'll be talking about today is what I'm calling a Cold War translation scandal. I'm using the term scandal not so much as theorized by Lawrence Venuti in his Scandals of Translation, but rather how it was theorized by Hélène Bouzelin in her article, Translations in the Making, where she writes, the fact that the work of translation, revision, rereading, correction, etc., which involves the presence of actors who are united in the same project, but whose viewpoints might diverge, could be the source of conflicts and sometimes scandals. This scandal, I propose, illustrates the emergence of the star translator. And in fact, it involves a young bilingual female editor and an older, highly respected male translator. Now, I qualify this as a Cold War scandal for two reasons. First, the selection and marketing of the book in question, Paradiso, by Cuban writer José Lezama Lima, was motivated to some degree by the fact that the book had been banned in Castro's Cuba for its Baroque style and its homoerotic content. Now, this was highlighted in the publisher's marketing material, the publisher being the New York-based Farrar, Straus and Giroux, one of the major post-World War II US publishers. And as they write, as Paradiso contains no political implications, no mention of the revolution, and frank discussions of homosexuality, a taboo topic in Cuba, Lezama has not been favored by the regime since the time of its publication in book form in 1966. The book, in fact, was initially allowed to be published. Apparently, Castro himself had read it and thought it was so obscure that the people wouldn't even understand it. It wouldn't be of any interest. And it became something of a succès de scandale. And apparently there are stories of people going into bookstores and libraries asking for chapter 8, which was the most homoerotic of the chapters in the book. And so it was subsequently banned in Cuba. Now, the scandal can also be described as a Cold War one, as it was shaped by what the editor would later critique as a system of privilege, one that emerged in the aftermath of World War II and led to the creation of star translators, which I will discuss at greater length later in the talk. But because this talk is based almost entirely on the archive of the publisher Farrar, Straus and Giroux, before presenting the scandal and its aftermath, I'd like to highlight some of the unique contributions to translation studies and to translator studies by archives such as these. First, archives offer insight into some of the most invisible agents of translation. In this case, as you will see, the editor, but also publishers and copy editors or revisers, among others. So editorial intervention, I would argue, remains one of the great unknown knowns of translation studies. We know that it happens, but we still know very little about it. So if translators are typically described as invisible, editors, and especially editors of translation, are doubly so, are rarely appearing on covers or frontispieces. Second, the archive provides unique insight into the networks of agents who contribute to the making of translations, showing how they negotiate at every stage of the process across asymmetries of power, both professional and social. And by professional, I'm meaning the status of the specific occupation or of the publisher, and social, meaning gender, race, and so on, and age as well. Let's look, for example, at this inter-office memorandum written by the acquisitions editor, Andre Conrad, to the publishers Farrar, Straus, and Giroux about her suggestion that they retain the original title. So the title of the book is in Italian, Paradiso, not in Spanish, Paradiso. And she gives several reasons why and suggests that they retain the Italian title. This document, to the younger viewers in the audience, may seem like some strange historical artifact, because this is an internal document. The addressees are given at the top only with their initials, and as one person read the memorandum and sent it on to the next person, they would cross off their initials at the top. And often these memos had some space for people to add comments. As you see at the bottom, all of the addressees add something, whether just okay with initials, sounds sensible. But note here the comment by Roger Strauss, who writes, "Good points, but the translator's view is important. What does Rabassa want?" This struck me as very interesting, and it's hard to interpret without further research, but this could suggest that the norm at the time was that the translator was not consulted in such decisions, including how to title the work, and that perhaps Strauss was an outlier, or that Strauss represents the emergence of this star translator culture in which the translator would eventually, especially the star translator like Rabassa, would be expected to be consulted over these decisions. Again, it's hard to say exactly, but I found it to be a curious document. Third, the archives often provide a counter narrative to the public narrative concerning the translation, and this is especially relevant when we're talking about scandals. If not debunking that public narrative, then at least complicating it in a number of ways that I'll show in this talk. So the translation scandal I'll be discussing today involved a young bilingual female editor at the New York-based publishing house Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Andre Conrad, and an older award-winning male translator, Gregory Rabassa, whom many of you will know, who would become for many the Anglophone face of the Latin American literary boom. So the picture, or the picture frame on the left, titled The Editor, is empty because it has been impossible for me to find a photograph of Andre Conrad, while there are countless images of Rabassa, including the photo on the bottom right, taken in the White House with George and Laura Bush when he was awarded the National Medal of the Arts in 2006, the highest civilian award in the field of the arts. This striking representational asymmetry symbolizes, I would argue, not only their unequal access to symbolic power, but also a broader cultural phenomenon of the late Cold War, that is the making of the first star translators, at least in the Anglophone world. I don't know that I can talk about other cultures. But as you see here, the subtitle of a 1977 article in the Wall Street Journal on Rabassa, which appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, read, "Gregory Rabassa is a star." One might ask whether we would have seen in the pre-war period a note like Strauss's on the interoffice memo that the translator's view is important. What does Rabassa want if Rabassa had not become a star? In any case, I mentioned this power asymmetry at the very beginning, as it is crucial to understanding not only the scandal itself, but the framing or the managing of the scandal post-publication. And so before presenting the archival record, which offers a somewhat different narrative, let me introduce the dominant framing of this translation scandal, which began to be disseminated by Rabassa soon after the much delayed publication of the translation. So part of the scandal involved not only the editor's dissatisfaction with Rabassa's initial draft translation, but also it had to do with the fact that the translation was grossly delayed by almost 3 years, much to the dissatisfaction of the original author as well as the publisher. And so the editor, Conrad, was in the middle, trying to negotiate, trying to assuage the dissatisfaction of those parties. So the framing, this dominant framing, first emerged in print in this Wall Street Journal article by Jeffrey Tannenbaum, for which Rabassa was interviewed. In that article titled, "The Translator's Role is Crucial and Delicate and Widely Unnoticed," Tannenbaum notes that Rabassa was, quote, "stung by criticism of Paradiso and certain other of his translations." Now, in an effort to be balanced in his coverage of the scandal, Tannenbaum presents the publisher's point of view as well, but in a paragraph that is set off by parentheses. And it reads, for its part, the publisher says its editor, who goes nameless here, who is bilingual, made the changes, quote, for reasons of readability, not salability. Interestingly, it's not clear whose words these are. They appear to be the publisher's. I don't think Conrad would have described her editing in those words. And it adds that Mr. Rabassa, dissatisfied with his own work, embraced the changes at the time. Quote, I think I could have worked a lifetime working on Paradiso and still would not have been satisfied. It quotes Mr. Rabassa as writing then. Again, note Conrad, who left the publisher shortly after the Paradiso scandal, was not interviewed by Tannenbaum, and as I said, her name is not mentioned. While mentioning the opposing viewpoint of the publisher, albeit literally parenthetically, Tannenbaum nevertheless concludes, quote, so far it would appear Gregory Rabassa has been right almost all the time, avoiding the brouhahas that some translations have caused. This particular framing of the scandal was further refined in a 2001 interview with Rabassa by Harry Morales titled, You Can't Say Ain't in Spanish, or Can You? A conversation with Gregory Rabassa, where in response to a question, I thought this was interesting, about the translator's ego, Rabassa himself brings up Paradiso. So Morales doesn't ask him specifically about the scandal. And Rabassa says, quote, I did feel that there were moments in the text of Paradiso where the editors had, quote, dumbed it down, thus straightening out Lezama Lima's arcane labyrinth. This interview, by the way, appeared in the journal Hopscotch, named for Jose Cortázar's novel, Rabassa's translation of which earned him the National Book Award in 1968, the first to be awarded both to the author and the translator. So you will see in the correspondence, especially between the publisher and the author, Lezama Lima, that Rabassa is often referred to as award-winning. While Rabassa directly addresses the scandal surrounding the editing of Paradiso in both articles, the opposing viewpoint of the publisher, let alone that of Conrad, the editor, is not mentioned in Morales. So we see the framing of the scandal becoming increasingly monoglossic, right? It is Rabassa's version. Now that framing is fully consolidated in the 2007 monograph, Translation and the Rise of Inter-American Literature by Elizabeth Lowe and Earl E. Fitz. In a chapter dedicated entirely Rabassa titled A Translator's Translator, Lowe and Fitz present the Paradiso scandal as a struggle between a master translator making a valiant attempt to produce a translation that was, quote, as close as you possibly can get to the novel in the original language, and a Philistine editor who, in the words of Lowe and Fitz, quote, subjected Rabassa's translation to a severe editorial laundering, chiefly for reasons of readability, placing readability in quotation marks, again, underscoring its dubious status as a marker of translation quality. And again, now it seems like readability is being attributed to the editor when it seems from the Tannenbaum, it was the words of the publisher. In any case, that this dominant version of the scandal is told from Rabassa's point of view is made clear in a number of ways. First, the editor's name is never used. So from the beginning, her name in all of these versions of the scandal, public versions, was never used. And in a footnote, doubt is cast on her bilingualism. Quote, the editor, who is said to have been bilingual. You may remember in Tannenbaum, he states clearly she was bilingual. Second, Rabassa's reactions are presented as fully justified. For example, quote, understandably upset with these changes. And his translation is, I would say, heroicized, quote, what Rabassa had labored so hard to achieve. Third, Conrad's editorial interventions are presented throughout in distinctly negative terms, described as severe editorial laundering that defanged and straightened out Lezama Lima's and Rabassa's Baroque creation. The section on Paradiso, in fact, ends with the following statement. Much to Rabassa's chagrin, one might say that not one but two silk purses, Lezama Lima's original and Rabassa's original translation of it, were turned into a sow's ear. Finally, Rabassa's discursive fingerprints are all over this version, which relies heavily on the interviews Rabassa first reported in Tannenbaum in the Wall Street Journal and then in Morales. And while Rabassa is heavily quoted in Lowenfitz, the source of these quotations is obscured, with several attributed to Morales. And of course, they were published in Morales, the person who conducted the interview, but they were Rabassa's words. Moreover, the aphorism quoted here relating to the making of a silk purse out of a sow's ear was in fact first introduced by Rabassa in his 1977 interview with Tannenbaum, although the genealogy of that expression is erased here. So all of this is to present the archival record as showing a different version of the scandal, right? And the archival record challenges this framing in a number of ways. First, it is abundantly clear that Conrad, who was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela, was indeed bilingual. She provided the initial reader's report recommending that the publisher acquire the translation rights to Lezama Lima's Paradiso, and she was responsible for translating all of the correspondence between the US publishers and Lezama Lima and his sisters. So in other words, translating the English memoranda letters from the publishers into Spanish and Lezama Lima's and his sisters' letters into English from Spanish. Conrad's translations and her original compositions in Spanish leave no doubt to her bilingualism. In fact, the doctoral student, my Spanish doctoral student with whom I'm working on this project with, has commented on the excellent quality of her translations, both into Spanish and out. Indeed, she displays not only linguistic proficiency, but stylistic versatility as well, composing a letter to Lezama Lima that imitated the florid prose of the author himself, and which she jokingly referred to as her gongorismo, a reference to the Baroque style of the Spanish poet Luis de Góngora. Rabassa, in fact, compliments her on it, quite, your gongorism came off very well, I thought. In English, too, Conrad's prose is quite sophisticated. For example, early in her professional relationship with Rabassa, she attempts to foster a kind of solidarity of intellectuals by writing, quote, I hope you weathered the deflowering of Luna with less apathy than I. My doctoral student came to me and said, what on earth is she referring to with the deflowering of Luna? And so I looked at the date of the letter, and I looked later in the letter where she mentions Armstrong, and it becomes clear she was referring to the moon landing in the late 1960s. And keep in mind, she was 23 or 24 when she wrote this. So again, quite sophisticated in both the language that she was using. So many of the initial letters between Conrad the editor and Rabassa the translator saw Conrad encouraging the translator, who was delayed in providing his first draft of the translation. She often ended her letters with words of encouragement, such as onward, onward, or in German, vorwärts, vorwärts, and onward. But Rabassa's delay left Conrad to deal with an increasingly frustrated source text author, Lezama Lima, on the one hand, and the US publisher on the other. Now, the publisher, who had hoped to issue the first translation of Lezama Lima's novel into a major European language, that is English, before any other, and had to witness the publication of the French and Italian translations as Rabassa struggled to complete his draft. Distracted by his work duties, he was a professor of Spanish language and literature at Queen's College. And also we see from the correspondence a broken arm and what appears to have been writer's block. Conrad would later make a crack in a letter to a British publisher that, quote, even with the aid of the French and English editions, Rabassa could not create a wholly successful version of Paradiso. The publication of the French translation, in fact, triggered an uncharacteristically stern letter from Conrad on March 24th, 1971. Quote, what I am trying to say is that the pressure to get the book out is mounting. I trust you are working hard on the material that remains, and I must ask you to give me the most specific estimate possible of when you will deliver the rest of the first draft and complete the revisions of the final manuscript, unquote. In his response of March 26, 1971, Rabassa expresses his preference for completing the entire draft before discussing Conrad's suggested edits. She concurs in her response of March 31. Quote, the Eumenides have been laid to rest. I go along with your idea of finishing the whole thing, then going back. She then returns to her encouragement. Onward to glory. And in a later letter, let this letter take the place of 6 nymphette cheerleaders, complete with mini skirts, bobby socks, and pom-poms. And bravo. When he finally submits the final installment in mid-October of 1971, she writes, all my very best, in parentheses, should I send you champagne? Most significantly, the archival documents provide a very nuanced look at the editor's interventions, which you will remember were described as defanging and dumbing down the original. Moreover, it is clear that she did not impose her editorial suggestions in some dictatorial fashion. In fact, she attempts several times to open a dialogue with the translator on the subject, attempts that Rabassa repeatedly rebuffs. Especially important in this regard are 2 lengthy letters, one from late December of 1969, which he wrote after reading the first 2 chapters of Rabassa's translation, and another in August 1971, 2 months before Rabassa submits the final installment of his translations. These letters, in my opinion, are masterclasses in delicacy. She opens the first letter by acknowledging the difficulty of translating Paradiso, so empathizing with the translator's task. Quote, I must again say, what a historic task you have set for yourself. Although you have never complained to me in any of your letters, I sense that the process of working on it must have seemed nightmarish to you, unquote. She also, at crucial points in the letters, reports to using the first person plural, emphasizing solidarity with the translator. The primary contents of these letters, however, consist of her general editorial advice, which seems less motivated by the simplistic aim of achieving readability than by what I consider a rather sophisticated understanding of comparative stylistics, which those of you in translation studies will recognize was emerging in beginning in the late 1950s and in the 1960s, right, as evident in Vinet and Darbonnay's Stylistique comparée du français et de l'anglais of 1958. We see it too in some translator prefaces, such as Vladimir Nabokov's preface to his own translation of his best-selling English language novel, Lolita. In that preface, he writes, movements, grimaces, landscapes, the listlessness of trees, smells, rains, the fading and the sparkling shades of nature. Everything that is affectionately human, however strange, and also very crude, juicy, and bawdy, come out in Russian no worse, if not better, than in English. But subtle reticence, which is so characteristic of English, the poetry of thoughts, the instantaneous interplay between very abstract concepts, the swarming of monosyllabic epithets, all of this, as well as everything related to technology, fashion, sports, natural sciences, and unnatural passions, become in Russian uncouth, verbose, and often repulsive in terms of style and rhythm. So just again, the idea that this was becoming very widespread in translation criticism to speak in terms of comparative stylistics. So compare these remarks by Nabokov to Conrad's description of the stylistic differences between Spanish and English. Quote, so much of the Spanish diction comes through here that I sense that you will abandon it in great part, to make an interpretive translation. This is a classic in Spanish, and I have the feeling that you will want to make it one in English too. She dedicates the following lengthy paragraph to explaining what she means by an interpretive translation, which she ends by invoking a mutual friend, the writer and translator from the Italian, R.W. Flint. Quote, our friend, the translator and peripatetic intellectual, R.W. Flint, once quoted some good advice to me, which I now pass on to you, and hope you will find it as useful as I have. This is Flint's advice. Quote, a kind and knowing soul once gave me a healthy warning against what he calls a quality of false precision in Italian prose, doubled ideas and words and finicking adverbs that don't really do any work. This is true of all Romance languages, I fear, and more than true of Spanish, and excruciatingly true of Lezama. She then switches to the first person plural. He can get away with it in Spanish. We will not be able to get away with it in English. She ends by authorizing a less literal approach to the translation, as if this is what Rabassa had been asking for all along, but was unsure the publisher would sanction. Quote, do forgive this long discursive letter. What I suppose I'm doing is expressing the fears I myself would feel if I had the job to do. But we do want you to know that we realize that no translator can be a slave to this text. While thanking Conrad for her useful suggestion, Rabassa expresses the desire once again to complete the first draft in its entirety before discussing any editorial suggestions, which, by the way, he describes as Englishing. Quote, once certain of accuracy and spirit, I will have an easier time of Englishing it in accordance with your advice. She follows up on February 16th with a 4-page list of editorial suggestions related to Lezama Lima's extended use of simile. Again, Rabassa resists engaging with Conrad's editorial suggestions. Quote, I think at this point, the wise thing would be for me to go along as I have and wait for what you and he, Lezama Lima, comment before proceeding to what can be the final form, unquote. She continues to send him her editorial suggestions, but he doesn't react, leading her to explain her editorial approach in a letter dated August 31st, 1970. Quote, I hope you approve of my editing. Bear in mind that I am attacking Lezama's efflorescence, not yours. My aim is to distill and at least give the wildly mysterious imagery a chance to reach the reader, like pruning a bush to give the branches breath and growing room. I hope you think this works and will use this manuscript as draft 2. In his response of September 11th, 1970, Rabassa mentions Conrad's edits only in a note at the very bottom. P.S. I have been letting both your edited pages and those I have got back from Lezama pile up because I feel more comfortable driving ahead than tidying up the battlefield behind. So again, he puts Conrad off and again minimizes her editorial interventions as tidying up. Now, Conrad doesn't raise the question of her editorial suggestions again until a year later, on October 18th, 1971, as Rabassa is nearing the end of the translation. She writes, seriously, I wonder if the time has come to take a look at the edited pages I sent you a while ago, to make some rebuttal to them. I'd like to begin sketching out in my mind a method for editing the translation, and I hope you will give me your thoughts in the matter, unquote. Only now does Rabassa acknowledge that he has resisted engaging with Conrad on the subject of the edits, not simply because he preferred to complete the draft as expeditiously as possible, but because, quote, details get me doubting myself and my work, all to the good, but I think I should go along as I have and drive it. Maybe Lezama needed an editor from the start. Note once again his rather dismissive characterization of Conrad's editorial suggestions here as details. In any case, given that the translation is not yet complete, Conrad backs off once again. Quote, the last thing I want is for you to doubt your word. Believe me, so don't look at those pages until the mother is finished. Clearly, Conrad had been hoping to discuss these issues early in the process so that the Rabassa could consider them when translating the remaining chapters. But of course, that did not happen. Toward the end of 1971, Rabassa suggests that his primary loyalty has been to Lezama Lima. Quote, during the doing of this, I tried to keep your suggestions in mind, although probably most often I was led by the prolixity of the original. Conrad would not return to the question of editing again until April 19th, 1973. This final letter makes clear, albeit still somewhat tactfully, Conrad's level of frustration with Rabassa. Instead of expressing sympathy for the translator, as she had done in her letter of December 23rd, 1969, she seems to appeal for sympathy for the editor and perhaps for the printer who will set the galley proofs. Quote, I have been out of the office the past month working on Paradiso, and I am now 2/3 of the way through a job of very close editing. Much of my work will be retyped to save the printer's eye. She then abandons the delicacy of her previous correspondence. Quote, I would like to have a conversation with you about this editing because I have never been sure what your attitude towards it is. She goes on then to elaborate not only an approach to translation, but to an ethics of translation. Quote, I want to be very frank with you. The reason the editing of this book has taken so long is that it has involved a tremendous amount of word-for-word pruning and sentence-by-sentence condensation. And every time I have telescoped something, it has provoked a crise de conscience and a renewal of my inner arguments about the question of responsible translation. According to Walter Benjamin, it is a sin for a translator to deviate even in points of syntax from the original. There are authors for whom I would willingly, constantly apply this dictum, but none of them wrote in Spanish, and I must certainly exclude Lezama and keep from thinking of the obnoxious professors who review for the TLS, sorry to my British audience, and will want to restore all 70-word sentences to their original length. I have felt all along that the discrepancy between the character of the two languages, that is, the unhurried verbosity of Spanish and the almost epigrammatic succinctness to which English lends itself, should be resolved somehow in favor of our own language for the sake of all concerned. Excuse me. And I do not think you want your translation praised merely for its patience and fidelity, although that is, of course, the safest route. In this letter, a final appeal to the translator to engage more actively in the editorial process. The conciliatory language appears only at the very end. Over and over, I have marveled at not only your fortitude for taking on this project, but also the clever solutions to the infinite problems it posed. Lezama's book is a masterpiece, a truly extraordinary feat, and because of it, almost impossible. I want to make sure that you accept and approve of the work I'm doing to make it a little more possible. By the way, Conrad's allusion to, quote, the obnoxious professors who review for the TLS finds its way, albeit without attribution, into Tannenbaum's piece for the Wall Street Journal, in which Rabassa references a fictional Professor Orrendo, whom he describes as, quote, nasty and always ready with a ningueño or put down, usually in the Times literary supplement. Now, there is no response from Rabassa to this letter in the archive. At this point, it appears that Rabassa is removed from the editorial process. In an interoffice memo to Roger Strauss dated June 19, 1973, Conrad informs him that she and Giroux have decided to employ the young Cuban poet Mercedes Cortázar to help with the editing, and that she would be acknowledged on the copyright page, although Rabassa would be credited as the sole translator. A few days later, in a letter to Ronald Christ of the Center for Inter-American Relations, which subtended the translation, Conrad praises Cortázar's contribution. Quote, the name of the Cuban poet who is checking the manuscript is Mercedes Cortázar. We have done about a week's work, and it makes all the difference in the world. In a short letter of June 26, 1973, Conrad complies with Strauss's instruction to inform Rabassa, explaining that he will not see the translation again until it is in galley proofs. Quote, it's just worthless to show you the manuscript in bits and pieces. So in a sense, using his own argument about not engaging with the editorial suggestions back at him, especially given his willingness to engage, his unwillingness to engage with her editorial suggestions along the way. Aware that this assertion of authority or editorial authority might offend Rabassa, she seeks to foreclose any objection by reassuring the translator, while also making it clear that the translation is now very much a group effort. Quote, I very much hope that it doesn't seem a high-handed proceeding to you. All I can do is assure you that 3 very intelligent people have been slaving to make this one of the finest translations ever achieved, for which, of course, Rabassa will receive sole credit. At the opening of that same letter, she notes that the editing she's undertaking with Cortázar, quote, is making the book grow on me more and more, underscoring the transformative nature of their editorial work. In that regard, it is interesting to note that Rabassa, upon receiving the proofs, downplays the extent of the edits, writing, quote, It has been so long since I was at work on it that it is hard for me to distinguish what I had written and what has been revised to some degree. He goes on to note one quote unquote grievous mistake in the proofs, and that is the misspelling of his name. So whatever you think of Conrad's editorial approach, it can hardly be described, I would say, as dumbing down, nor was it done in an editorial fashion. It is, in fact, firmly grounded in comparative stylistics. Moreover, her approach was from the start collaborative, attempting to initiate a conversation with Rabassa about the editing, to which he never responds. In the end, it is difficult to assess the extent of Conrad's and Cortázar's editorial interventions, as the various versions of the manuscript translation are not available in the archive. Rabassa's archive only contains what looks like the final version. Now, he later undertook, very interestingly, a retranslation for Dalkey Press, apparently to write the record, but the changes he makes to that version are hardly significant. They are not extensive in any way. So I don't think they reflected the original version of his translation. So while Conrad's voice emerges quite clearly from the archive, her work on the manuscript appears to be lost to history. So now to the aftermath of the scandal. So it appears Conrad had been instructed by the publishers, perhaps Roger Strauss in particular, who seems to have always been defending Rabassa, to take the fall for Rabassa. And she was not happy about it. As she writes in her letter to Tom Rosenthal of July 27, 1972, quote, "I was told to confess to you that the translation of Lezama Lima's Paradiso has been postponed on account of my tardy editing." She is unwilling, however, to accept all the blame, as evident in a letter to Lezama Lima of August 10, 1972. "I am chagrined and sorry for this long time we have taken, and accept part of the blame myself. However, I am certain that you would not wish the book to be published in English until the translation is as exceptional as Paradiso deserves." In the following years, Conrad would seek to set the record straight. For example, in her biographical blurbs, she makes sure to mention her editorial contribution to the English translation of Paradiso, as evident here in her lengthy biographical note accompanying a 2020 volume of her translations of the poetry of Mercedes Cortázar. Note, in particular, while associate editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, she edited the translation of José Lezama Lima's Paradiso and other books originally written in Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Note, she does not mention Rabassa as the translator of Paradiso, nor does Rabassa mention Conrad in the chapter on Paradiso in his memoir, If This Be Treason, of 2006. He does, however, praise Roger Strauss for his decision to keep Paradiso in Italian as the title, unaware perhaps that it was Conrad who had initially proposed it in the interoffice memoranda I showed earlier. Incidentally, Mercedes Cortázar also makes note of her editorial work on Paradiso in her biography posted on the site of the Cintas Foundation, founded in 1963 to support Cuban arts and the humanities. Quote, "Later, she was the poetry consultant for our Straus and Giroux for the English translation of José Lezama Lima's novel Paradiso." She too omits Rabassa's name. Conrad's detailed biographical note is also interesting in terms of her self-presentation. By indicating her place of birth as Caracas, Venezuela, she establishes her linguistic credentials. She also displays an editor's awareness of the cultural capital of the major US publishers, mentioning that she worked at Farrar, Straus and Giroux and published translations with Knopf and Harper and Row, three of the largest and most prestigious publishing houses of that time. Moreover, she makes clear that she not only edited and translated, but also reflected on the process by mentioning the critical essay she wrote, Editor, Author, Translator, which appeared in a 1974 issue of the journal Translation, published by Columbia University. Note the order of the roles in the title: Editor, Author, Translator. The essay opens with a strong indictment of a publishing system built on asymmetries of power, or what Conrad refers to, quote, a structure of prestige built upon the lack of integrity and the incompetence of both editors and translators. She then elaborates the quote, most blatant of evils hidden within a system. According to Conrad, they include the following. One, the monolingual editor who neither reads the foreign books he contracts to publish nor consults them in order to edit their translations. Two, the translator whose reason for undertaking assignments is mercenary rather than literary. Three, the translator who dictates his translation into a tape recorder to save his valuable time. Four, the academic who fulfills his annual publish or perish needs with translations. Five, the translator who exploits ambitious graduate students or friends in need by subcontracting to them a job which they would probably never have been assigned owing to their lack of prestige, and publishing it under his own name. Those evils, she asserts, are deliberately hidden or disguised, quote, for the sake of such prestige symbols as good reviews and translation prizes. Now, it was in this essay that Conrad exacts her most direct revenge on Rabassa, who had put her through editorial hell. She begins her attack obliquely. Quote, some of the most appalling translations ever produced have come from the typewriters of translators whose greed or arrogance led them to accept assignments without considering whether their gifts were suited to those jobs. She then zeroes in on Rabassa, but without ever invoking his name. Many translators have made the same stupid mistake, but have had to suffer much longer periods for their rashness. One translator I know fell to 6 martinis, reluctantly accepting a very long and difficult novel of whose reputation he was well aware. He did not begin to translate, probably because of the psychological block produced in him by the book's formidable reputation, until 2 months before his deadline. The book was finally published 5 years later, after 2 editors, a copy editor, and a poetry consultant had spent countless hours trying to unravel the sodden mass of impossible and ridiculous sentences he had produced. While the publisher ultimately decided to let Rabassa appear on the cover as the sole translator, preserving his reputation as one of the great English language translators of Latin American literature, a translation star, Conrad seeks to set the record straight by revealing the many hands involved in transforming Rabassa's sodden mass of impossible and ridiculous sentences into something publishable and even admirable. What she does not mention, of course, is that 2 of those individuals, the editor and the poetry consultant, were young bilingual women who had to negotiate their roles with older male publishers on the one hand and an older male translator on the other. In that regard, it is notable that Lezama Lima's sister, Eloisa, who was living then in Puerto Rico and so was part of the negotiations of this translation project, thanks all 3 in a letter to Roger Straus, acknowledging receipt of the English translation of Paradiso. I was moved. I was very moved, since I know how difficult a labor it must have been. Please convey my gratitude to Rabassa, Mercedes Cortázar, and Andre Conrad. I reached out to Andre Conrad for comment. She's currently living in Miami, Florida with Mercedes Cortázar, but she declined to reply, leaving the last word to the archive. I will end there. Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much. What an amazing story. I'm sure I've been making plentiful notes here, and I'm sure the others in the audience have been too. And can I invite our audience now to please pop your questions in the Q&A field, and I'll be happy to put your questions to Brian. And I note that Raúl Colón has put some very interesting thoughts into the chat as well. And can I invite you, Raúl Colón, if you want to put a specific question to our speaker, please do. Well, we have a first question already, actually, from Peter Bush. And Peter says, "Hi, Brian, fascinating. The translation of the homoerotic imagery in, say, chapter 8 is consistently less adventurous in the English than the Spanish. Is that the result of editorial ideas about the necessary succinctness of English, or Rabassa's lack of adventurousness? I would resist an editor being involved in editing before the translation is finished, though it can happen if there are time constraints."
Yeah. That's a great question. And hi, Peter. It's great to hear from you. What I think is interesting, and yes, I agree with you that as a translator, it's often intrusive, except that she was so alarmed by the initial drafts that she hoped to start a conversation early in such a way that it might modify his translation. In terms of the homoerotic content, unfortunately, one thing that's lacking in the archive are all the versions of the edited version. So unfortunately, we don't know where that happened. Because certainly that content became a marketing feature, a marketing point for the publisher. But yes, toned down, it's unclear who did that or why. So unfortunately, as comprehensive as this archive is, it is a commonly accepted truth in archival studies that no archive is complete, if only because they are biased in terms of textual records. So, water cooler conversations are not going to be part of the archive. And in this case, yeah, very frustratingly, the edited versions are not there. So we can only go by the discourse. And one apology, I know that I gave the name of the author of Hopscotch as Jose, it's Julio Cortázar, so my apologies.
Brian, you talked about how how so much of the problem here is a kind of almost timeless sexism, really, here about a male translator kind of abusing his position when it comes to female collaborators. He seems along the way to have alienated them all big time. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the Cold War aspect of your title then, and about because presumably are you arguing that kind of abusive relationship was more prevalent under Cold War conditions, or is it other ways in which you would want to argue that this story is particularly typical of the Cold War situation? Is it to do with the fact that this is specifically a Cuban writer then, for whom Rabassa feels he can act in this way?
So yes, the Cold War comes into this in a couple different ways. I'm not sure that people would have raced to publish a translation of this article, which is, I'm sorry, this novel, which is extremely dense. And even my Spanish student says he has trouble getting through it, had it not been that it was banned in Cuba. So it became a Cold War talking point, and that was part of the marketing ploy for the novel. And remember, it was not just this novel, but when when Castro had basically expelled gay writers very early on in like 1960, then all of a sudden this idea, and this is something my student is exploring in his dissertation, at what point, considering that we had the lavender scare in the 1950s in the United States, where so many people were dismissed from government positions under suspicion of being homosexual, that all of a sudden in the 1960s, publishers are starting to promote these novels with homoerotic content. So we're trying to explore that content and what a shift that was. And partly it was the treatment of gay writers by Castro that made it into a cause célèbre a little bit, partly also the sexual revolution, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously a very complex phenomenon, but we're looking at that aspect of this Cold War thing. And then the idea that Rabassa had a certain growing power because he was being made into a star. And so we're trying to explore that star network that was a Cold War phenomenon and it was made possible by a number of things. Number one, that there was subvention for translations that was historically unavailable before. And these were Cold War vehicles to promote interactions, exchanges, especially with non-aligned countries and with Latin America. So the Center for Latin American Relations was hugely important in all this. So the martini-soaked lunch she's referring to was with the head of the center, who was trying to woo Rabassa to undertake the translation. So in that sense too, it was they had money for these translations, also making it less risky for them to publish something like Paradiso at this time. So the structures and the emergence of a star translator maybe made him more protected, I think, in this ecosystem than he might have been in another time. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes, I seem to have jumped the gun a bit there because Andrea Ritivoy has asked a similar question. Such a fascinating story. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and asked, can you please say a little more about the Cold War aspect of the case? Brian Taylor asks, well, thank you for such a great lecture, Brian. I'm curious about Paradiso's reception in Cuba itself. Have the censorship bodies changed over time? And was it circulated underground a la Samizdat?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. Yes, there was this initial Cuban translation, and it survived in copies in Cuba, but not only in Cuba, in other Latin American countries. Then there was an authorized edition, one authorized by Lezama Lima, that was published under the editorship of Julio Cortázar in Mexico City. And that became the authorized translation, which was used for this translation. So it's very interesting thinking about this through the lens of the Cold War. I had assumed that this novel would not be published on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so I was very surprised to find that in the late 1970s, there was a Polish translation, and it was unabridged, and it had an introduction that mentioned the homoerotic content. And even something kind of funny, that if you're expecting something, really racy, you're not going to find it because, it's not terribly explicit. So again, the idea that there was a lot of unpredictability in this Cold War ecosystem, and that this Polish publisher was one that specialized in Latin American literature, which was, for whatever reason, hugely popular in Poland. And they decided to translate a Polish translation. So yeah.
Right. Raul Colon has indeed responded to my invitation and is asking if you're familiar with the other. So, following on from your point about the Polish translation, the other translations of Paradiso into French, into Italian, Portuguese, Norwegian, and perhaps then how these compare to the English version. Are there similar issues at stake in those other translations?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I haven't looked extensively at the French and Italian. Those would be the most interesting to me because they came out before the English, and it's very likely that Rabassa consulted them. So yes, I'd be very interested to see. And I think when Conrad makes mention of those two, she's like, but these are Romance languages, and so the difference between Spanish and French and Italian isn't going to be as vast as between English style and English. But yes, we're assuming that Rabassa consulted those. Yep.
Right. A question in the chat from Mukherjian, who says, "Thank you, Brian, for this interesting presentation. I wonder whether you've encountered this type of scandalous translation in the Soviet Union."
Yes, actually, people have done some really great archival work because the Soviets kept meticulous records. So they had every minutes of every editorial meeting, and they kept every draft of the thing. So people like, Samantha Sherry, who did a wonderful monograph on the editing of translations at the Inostronya Literatura, the main translation journal, and was able to document how porous Soviet censorship actually was, how negotiated it was at every stage. So it could be very targeted, like, oh, if we just replace this one word, or we soften this, or someone would say, oh no, this isn't so bad, and then they would let it go. And then of course readers also became adept at reading the euphemistic language and so on. So nothing of this. Maybe in terms of a scandal, I would mention the translation of Proust, which started in the mid-20s, as a group translation under the leadership of the brilliant translator Adrian Frankowski. And many people were in that group. Andrei Fyodorov was one of the translators. And they were able to publish volumes of that up through the late 1930s, even though during the 30s, Proust was increasingly problematic. He was often mentioned together with Joyce as a decadent modernist. So in the Soviet discourse, always Proust and Joyce, decadent modernist. But the 1941 translation of, I believe it was La Prisonnière, was already in proofs, and they took it out and destroyed the proofs. So then there was no more discussion of Proust. Even in Andrei Fyodorov's writings on translation, which came out after that, he eliminated any mentions of his translation of Proust, which had appeared in earlier critical works. So Proust becomes persona non grata until late Soviet, the Perestroika era. So that destroying the proofs is one of the scandals I would note. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if I could pick up on the star translator aspect then of this story, and I was wondering, do you think it's in the interest then of Conrad and of the publisher to be so self-effacing ultimately, and to have Rabassa's name alone as the translator on the cover then? I mean, to what extent are they kind of complicit in promoting this star translator, basically to sell more books?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's what the archive is so vast, I couldn't talk about that aspect of it. But yes, that's what's very interesting. They had their investment in raising up Rabassa as a star because it helped them get the rights from Lezama Lima. So they kept telling him, we are getting the finest possible translator for you. Don't worry, but this is taking a little longer because, and what's interesting is she has a letter very early on to Lezama Lima, and she tells a few lies in there. She's like, oh, the first translator we asked, the award-winning, agreed. Well, he wasn't the first. We know from the archive they had reached out first to Di Giovanni, who was well-known as the translator of Borges, and he became famous because he actually, helped Borges, and we had a very close personal relationship, and even translated Borges with the collaboration of Borges. So they went to him first. And I think he had other commitments and he couldn't take it. Then they went to Rabassa. But yes, in the correspondence, he's regularly referred to as award-winning. And again, was the first translator to win the National Book Award when it was given both to the translator and to the author in 1968. And it was for his translation of Hopscotch by Cortázar, which of course becomes a kind of canonical text of the Latin American boom and represented the kind of, how shall I put it, aesthetics that the West and especially the US was promoting as the alternative to socialist realism. So this kind of highly aesthetic, filled with linguistic play, self-referential stuff. Yeah, so very important work. So yes, it's a complex ecosystem.
Thank you. Yes, a former PhD student of mine, Motoko Akashi, wrote her dissertation precisely on celebrity translators, and was particularly interested in the culture in Japan, and was pointing out just how much more prevalent the celebrity translator idea and celebrity translators are in Japan than in particular the English-speaking world. And I wonder whether, again, coming back to chronology, would you say that the celebrity or the star translator then emerges in this Cold War period and then kind of reaches an early peak, and then celebrity translators, star translators, are kind of less visible, perhaps? And how would you tell that story about kind of the figure of the star translator chronologically in the Anglophone world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And as I said, many people were invested in this star system. So yes, the publisher, because it helped them get the rights from the author. The author, of course, liked to think he was being translated by the greatest English author, translator of Spanish literature. But also other translators had something of us, because Rabassa was getting so much publicity, right? And it was good for translation and translator. I mean, the idea that that story was on the front page of the New York Times is astonishing to me. So yes, when it starts to change, I haven't looked at the evolution, but I was more interested in what the conditions were that made that possible. And I think what we see is the appearance of these awards, the appearance of subvention. So especially in the US, CIA, covert CIA subvention of a lot of these organizations, which is then revealed in a series of exposés in the New York Times in the late 60s. And then they switch from that model to using these grant organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera, to fund these. So all of those, the money, the prestige, and then again, so many people, and many people, he was a wonderful teacher, Rabassa, and he had a devoted following of students. And of course, they too were added to his prestige because, yes, he was known to be a really wonderful mentor and teacher. So, yeah.
Thank you. And what would you say is the role then of the publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, in this? I mean, is this from their point of view, is this a one-off case dealing with Rabassa and Lezama Lima, or are there other instances of this kind of practice going on at that publishing house during this period?
Yeah, it's hard to say. We haven't pinpointed other archives that we might look at to see how typical it was. We're assuming that at least the major New York-based publishers were in such competition that we would find similar practices, but that remains to be documented. Of course, many of these archives are scattered. We were lucky that most of the materials were held at the New York Public Library in a single archive. But bizarrely, the reader's report that Conrad wrote encouraging the publisher to try to get the rights and publish this was in another archive. It wasn't in the Strauss-Giroux archive. So that's strange too. And I can't remember if it was maybe in the, we looked also at the Elizabeth Bishop archive. So many people were involved in this. And again, I could only give a snapshot, but they also reached out to Elizabeth Bishop as one of our poets. They said our writers, because she was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, but she was living in Brazil at the time. So they felt that she would be a great person to kind of be a cultural mediator of this Spanish language novel for American readers. So they reached out, and initially they thought she was going to write the introduction. And that turned out not to be the case. And then when they were trying to get manuscripts to Lezama Lima in Cuba, at one point, I mean, they went through his sister in some cases, but they appealed to Susan Sontag, who was, again, another of their writers who was traveling to Cuba. And apparently she brought some manuscripts to get to Lezama Lima. So one of the other problems too was the delay in correspondence when Lezama Lima was responding to questions from the translator, that was also a cause of delay. Yeah, so like a lot of people were involved in this ecosystem.
Absolutely. And so your sense is that the archive has not been tampered with, that there hasn't been any kind of culling of material, because you were talking about how there are clearly, particularly Conrad's edits are not there in the archive, but was that simply standard archiving practice at the time, or do you suspect any skullduggery there as well?
Yeah, no, I have no idea, actually. I mean, I know other archives in which they are kept. In Rabassa's, he has his edits of this for this retranslation with Dalkey Press. So I don't know that it's a norm necessarily. They could have been taken by Conrad when she left Farrar, Straus and Giroux shortly after this scandal. I think it really left her with a bad taste in her mouth. So it's hard to say. But what we can, once you curate the archive, so we got all of these papers completely uncurated, so like in no order whatsoever. So once you curate the archive, you can kind of tell whether there are missing correspondence, because they will refer to, oh, I'm responding to your letter of XX. And the correspondence appears to be quite complete. Again, bizarrely, the reader's report, which should have been in there, wasn't. So it's hard to say why some things are missing. Yeah.
Thank you. Peter Bush has come back with a follow-up question about Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Did they decide not to translate the sequel to Paradiso? Right.
Yeah, they did not. Yeah. But again, I think the funding that Peter will be aware that Center for Inter-American Relations was so important in terms of funding these projects. So it allowed, and because they had a slight, at one point they were CIA backed. I mean, so there was this idea that they had a political eye, even though I think the heads of that would have denied it. But, choosing works that they could make a Cold War argument about, like Lezama Lima's Paradiso. But yeah, these funding agencies were very important.
Thank you. I wonder how you see your role now in this scandal. Would you, because presumably the book is still promoted as translated by Rabassa alone. I mean, would you like to see finally a recognition of the role of the others and of Conrad in particular in the production of the book better now, finally?
Well, I would say that one of the issues that I had to contend with and that maybe affected my scholarly objectivity was I became a little obsessed with Conrad. But as you see from her letters, her voice is so well defined. I mean, she had such a style, she had such a way with words. And I kept thinking, wow, this person is 23 or 24. This is her first job. And, as I said, when my student came, what is the deflowering of Luna? I thought, who is this person who talks like this, who writes like this? So I became very obsessed with her as a figure. And, hoping at some point maybe she'll have archives that are left. But I hope it, as I say, I do think one of the great known unknowns of translation studies is the role of editors. And not everyone plays such a visible role as her, but to see the negotiations, and I, again, just in terms of the complex diplomacy. And then again, I didn't really talk about her letters to Lezama Lima, but there she has to calm him down because he's very upset that it's so delayed. So she's going in one direction to him and then back to the translator. So I became completely obsessed with her.
I think what came across to me was the disjunction between the public and the private face of this relationship, if you like, because both of them, after the event, are dismissing the other, the role that the other played, and you gave some pretty scathing comments from Conrad then about Rabassa, and similarly then Rabassa dismissing the role that she was playing as an editor. And yet, when you're looking at the correspondence, and I was struck by she's giving him advice, and clearly he was accepting that at the time, and she wouldn't have. He would have broken off the correspondence perhaps if he was too offended. So there's clearly a kind of parity there, despite their difference in age and seniority, etc., etc. During at the time of the correspondence, at the time that they're both working together on this project, even if then afterwards they're going to kind of disown that closeness. Would you say it was even a friendship at the time?
Well, certainly there are letters where she tried to cultivate a certain friendship, a kind of intellectual understanding, like, this deflowering of Luna, or, she made a joke when he broke his arm that I forget what she said. Something about, they say long distance runners should never ski, right? Because you might break your leg, and the translators should never. I forget how he injured it playing tennis or something. So should never play tennis. But so yes, there was a lot of jocularity, especially in the early years. But she's the one, it appears, who had broke off the contact. And what makes her, the fact that she doesn't mention Rabassa in her biographical sketch, despite the fact that he was a star translator, suggests that she was indeed still upset by this. She had more invested in naming him than he had in naming her, right? Yeah.
Right. Yes. Andrea Ritivoy asks, have you found any information about how this translator worked with other editors, especially male editors or people in with higher positions in the power hierarchy?
Yeah, so after she leaves Farrar, Straus and Giroux, I don't think she has a similar position anywhere. So she starts publishing translations. She edits translations. She started working closely with Mercedes Cortázar on translating her poetry, etc. So I don't know that she ever had a similar role. But again, it's been incredibly difficult to find anything out about her and her biography. And so that's something still in progress. And you think just in our age of the internet, you'd have some photo, something, and it's been very difficult to find anything. So I'm thinking of going, she went to Smith College, and I think they keep pretty good alumni records. So I was thinking of going there to see if I could find something. But yeah, even in terms of her symbolic capital, you may have noticed in the writings, her first name is spelled in all different ways. So there's an instability. Two E's, sometimes with the accent aigu, sometimes without, sometimes one E. So yeah, it also suggests, her. But then, of course, he complains that in the proofs they misspelled his name. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
What about the other way around then? Because I think that's Andrea's question. Rabassa working with other editors, then was he working with male editors perhaps and responding to them in different ways?
This is interesting. I have no idea. I know that people who worked with Rabassa, who studied under Rabassa, I mean, he has a huge following. And when I gave a version of this talk to in the audience was one of Rabassa's students who wrote a lot about Rabassa. She had never heard anything about this. So this could be a one-off, so I can't say.
Okay. And what about the what about retranslations then? Because you said that Rabassa himself did some fairly minimal, you said, changes in a later version, but there's never there's the publisher has never been tempted to commission a new translation of this work.
Right. So the re-edited version by him, or I don't think it's really a retranslation, it was slightly
Mm.
re-edited, was published by Dalkey Press. So yeah. So for our Strauss and Giroux did not consider a new
But
translation.
it's not. I mean, the translation was not deemed so defective that it needed recommissioning from a new translator.
Right. And as we said, my student went through the Dalkey re-edition or retranslation and the final manuscript, and the changes are minimal.
Mm, mm. Okay.
But it gives him the right to say, "Oh, this is so bad, I retranslated it." I guess.
Okay. Well, I think uh, we have covered all of the questions that have come through. So can I perhaps start to round things up? We are coming up to the end of our time in any event. Peter Bush joined us for some questions today, but in fact, our next BCLT online research seminar is going to be an event with Peter Bush, and we're going to be celebrating on the 19th of November the publication of Peter's new translation of Proust. And we talked about Proust also today, and Peter is publishing with Oxford World's Classics a new volume of Proust in the World's Classics Proust translation series. The Guermantes Way is coming out next month, and we'll be celebrating that on the 19th of November in a hybrid event. So Peter will be in Norwich with us, and we'll also be able to share that event online with you. So do join us again next month for that event. For now, though, Brian, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing rich that really rich history with us, and this remarkable story that you've uncovered with your student from the archive. And thank you to everyone for your questions. Thank you to our audience, and above all, thank you, Brian, for a really fascinating seminar today.
Thank you.
Thank you.